This conference is about the costs and benefits of climate policy and the things we do to tackle climate change. And what I would like to present to you is a brief summary of the costs to ordinary people as a consequence of the policies being adopted in Europe for the last 20 years. You've heard in the previous session that there is a big problem in the developing world with energy poverty. We know that about 800 million people in Africa don't even have access to electricity at all. But most of you might be unfamiliar with the fact that energy poverty is a growing problem in one of the richest, or what used to be one of the richest parts of the world, in Europe. And that's the topic of my talk. So when we talk about energy poverty, traditionally we talk about developing countries, about people without access to electricity or without cooking facilities. And that's the picture we hear or know about. And this is one of the reasons why there is no international agreement on the climate issue, because the developing world rightly says, look, you Americans, you Europeans, you developed and got wealthy and well-to-do on the back of cheap energy, and now you're telling us we shouldn't use cheap energy, we should go for the more expensive forms of energy. And they can't agree on that very issue because they are quite aware that they can't afford to do it. So energy poverty in Europe is a growing and rising issue, and not just in poorer countries in Eastern or Central Europe, but even in one of the wealthiest parts in Germany. Roughly 1 million households are being switched off the electricity system annually because they can't pay their energy bills. So it is a problem that is faced by somewhere, the estimates are somewhere between 50 and 125 million Europeans. Thank you very much. Which is somewhere between 10 and 20% of the European population. And there is no European definition of what constitutes energy poverty, but in general, it's families who struggle to keep their homes warm in winter or struggle to pay their electricity bills. This is particularly problematic for countries that are suffering from economic downturns. Europe is stagnating. They are realizing that on climate energy policy, they've been doing the heavy lifting. They've introduced all these unilateral targets, both in terms of CO2 emissions and also in terms of renewable energy targets, whereas the rest of the world is basically doing business as usual. And they're beginning to realize that this differential treatment of countries around the world is detrimental to Europe's economy and Europe's competitiveness. This affects all countries in Europe, but particularly Eastern Central European countries have high levels of energy poverty. And of course, as Fritz already told you, Europe has some of the world's highest energy costs. So energy in Europe is somewhere between 2 and 3 times more expensive than energy in America. And the biggest threat, or let's put it this way, politicians were less concerned about the poor because the poor don't tend to vote. But when European companies began to tell governments that they are no longer investing in Europe, but going to the US to build factories in the US because of cheap gas, that's when policymakers became really concerned, because what it meant is that, particularly for energy-intensive industries, Europe is no longer a place where you can actually have a profitable and competitive industry. And then we have reports from all over Europe where people are either dying in great numbers in cold winters because they can't heat their homes, or a few years back in Greece, where we're almost back to medieval times, where it's cheaper to go into the forest and cut down trees to heat your home than to pay your electricity coming from the grid. And even in wealthy countries like Britain, people, pensioners and people who are on the low incomes suffer severely. And these reports you can find on an annual basis, and it's not very nice. But it is ignored that if you introduce a policy that makes energy artificially more expensive, some people will not be able to cope. Of course, if you are a middle class, middle income family and you want to look good and you can afford even to have a solar panel on your home, these people will pay you, because we're talking about the subsidies are being paid for. The renewables are paid by ordinary people on their electricity bills. That's the way it works in Europe. So big landowners who make 10 or 20 million euros per year for their wind farms, that money is being paid by the pensioners and by ordinary families. So it is, in a way, one of the biggest wealth transfers from poor to rich Europe has ever seen. So we already said that energy prices in Europe are some of the highest in the world. And part of the increase in energy costs has to do with the expanding renewable energy taxes, with the levies, with the subsidies, because countries that begin to cut these subsidies, and many European countries over the last 2-3 years have begun to cut subsidies. Some have abolished them altogether. Spain abolished subsidies for wind farms. The next year, not a single wind farm was built. So where that happens, renewable energy deployment decreases, and in fact, renewable energy in Europe has collapsed over the last 5-6 years by 50%. So there's now 50% less investment in renewables, simply because governments have cut the subsidies quite dramatically. As I said, overall, we're talking about subsidies amounting to €1 trillion over the last 20 years or so. That is money that's flown from ordinary families into the pockets of those who can afford to put up a wind farm or a solar farm. By and large, the top 1 or 2% of Europe's population has reaped this reward. And it partly explains the anger and growing resistance to a system that only benefits a very, very small section of the public, which obviously claims that they are very good and saving the world, but it's a very costly and burdening experience for those people who struggle to pay the bill. As I said, for industry, the big problem now is that Europe is a region of the world where energy-intensive companies no longer invest. You have high labor costs and high energy costs, and that is, of course, poisonous for any investment. Many European companies are now investing in the US, and that is not surprising. It is swimming in cheap energy. Yes, so to summarize, one of the reasons why there is a political backlash in Europe against the whole agenda has to do with the unfairness and the economic burden these policies have forced families into ever increasing costs, and the unfairness that they can see that the only people benefiting from the renewable energy expansion has been a very, very small group of people. And they are no longer willing to, there's a threshold basically. Everyone wants to save the planet, and everyone is willing to pay some money to save the planet. But it comes a threshold where people saying, okay, up till here, I'm willing to save the planet, but if it's more expensive than that, let someone else save the planet. And I think we are at that situation in Europe right now. Thank you.